was doing a Masters in Public History, and I volunteered and did an internship at the Melbourne Museum, and then at the Jewish Museum, and ultimately started volunteering here at the Holocaust Centre. It was really interesting. I was working with the curator, Saba Feniger, who is a survivor, and just interacting with a lot of survivors, learning on, in the setting of a museum, learning about putting exhibitions together, and also having had experience, from a few other museums. So all those skills were combining. I hadn't originally thought I'll be working in a museum necessarily, but I started to really appreciate the medium for telling stories and conveying history. So I just sort of fell in love with the whole idea of working in a museum, and I didn't know what was going to happen, but after some time, Saba Feniger, who was well in her 70s, announced that she was planning to retire, and I applied for the job and was successful. So it was only 2 days a week back then, but over time it's become almost a full-time job. So yeah, that's really the way. It was just by volunteering and learning in museums how they operate. I was here from about 2000, 2001, and it's even just funny to think, even just doing research back then was not, the internet wasn't as your main tool. You were looking through encyclopedias and books. You were spending a lot more time looking at books to do research, and gradually the internet is the go-to place to find out information, and a wealth of information. So even just from a research perspective, that decade that I've been here, just the accessibility of digital material for a researcher has been incredible, and it's hard to think how I researched an exhibition back in the first few years when I was here compared to how I use online resources now. And that's reflected in the museum itself. When I started, there was one television screen that was showing images of children, and I think it had a soundtrack that was switched off a lot of the time. That was the Cherished Children display. Then they got a bank of computers that never seemed to work, so that was a major headache. And it taught me early on that one of the challenges of putting screens in a museum is having the financial support on hand to be able to very quickly repair something that's gone wrong, because I find very annoying when I go into a museum and the screen's blank, it's not working, it's a reality, and it happens to us all, even just at our desks at work, but it's frustrating. So you want to know that when you're putting material into a museum, when you're putting screens in, you've got the ability to very quickly fix a problem. That's really the major headache of digital media in museums, just the upgrade of the equipment, the cost and the upgrade and the maintenance, because a blank screen is just an empty space. So that's one real important consideration for digital media. But on the other side, it's the ability to have such a range of material at the disposal, at the easy access of a visitor, compared to what you can put in display cases and what you can put in panels on walls or images on walls. It opens up a huge range of resources to the visitor. So that's the benefit, I guess. So there are two things that come to mind. First of all, the first challenge is, so we'll talk about interactive material second, but first of all, we've got a number of screens which just have clips of survivors talking, and most of the clips only go for a minute or so. So anyone walking past can watch 1 or 2 minutes and hear survivors with really powerful little accounts in those minutes. And they're all, heavily controlled by the curator, I guess. So there's no interactivity, and I think they're really powerful. The issue is that when you've got survivors in the museum and then there's survivors on the screen, we'd prefer people to be interacting with the survivor who's in the museum rather than the survivor on the screen. We really created those for the screens for those times when people are walking around and there isn't a survivor available to talk to them, or perhaps the survivor's there but he's talking to someone else, he or she's talking to someone else. So having those clips is, I think, a really powerful way of having a survivor presence in the museum. But the second issue is with the interactive content. So I don't see those clips as being in any way edutainment. They are just educational clips of survivors talking. The issues with the story pods and the gamification of the Holocaust, this is always an uncomfortable aspect. That if I go, we've created these story pods, they're interactive. There's on each one, let's say 6 or 7 survivor stories. You can touch a survivor and then their whole desk appears, and then you can click on different things and you can see their documents, you can see their photos, you can hear them speak. And together all the things on one survivor's desk can convey their story. If you sit and, interact with a number of items, or you can just interact with one and just get one little glimpse into that survivor's world. So conceptually, it's a great way to bring a whole lot of material into, a small screen. But what's worrying is when you see, you unleash these things onto a public, and then you see kids just click, click, click like it's a game. What happens if I hit on this? What happens if I hit on that? But they're not actually taking in the content that you've got there. So that's always going to be a risk. People can walk. The students who come here, they're on a school excursion. They haven't chosen to come to a Holocaust museum. They haven't chosen to learn about the Holocaust. We hope that through the whole program they become challenged, and they start wondering and they start engaging, and then when they look at a story pod, that they will hit something and then go wow, and actually spend 1 minute to explore that item. I mean, that would be great, and that's what we hope for. But there's always going to be kids who come here, they're not really their choice, they're not really going to engage. You're never going to get through to those students anyway. They might just hit things, and you can only hope that maybe something just sticks with them. But it's a danger that it's a little bit of a game. Let's explore. But I don't think, it's not a game, so it's not like they're shooting Nazis or something. So there's no game element to it. It's just the only real danger is that they might not actually take anything away from their experience of hitting. But interesting thing is that in the last year, we launched we put the story pods. We made a StoryPod Lite version as an app that's downloadable, and we've had about 2,000 people download it. So once again, I don't know what they're doing with it once they get home, but there's 10 survivor stories, a bit of video material, and we don't know what they're doing with it when they get home, but we can only hope that there's survivor stories for people to engage with.
I guess part of the goal is to get people into the museum as well once they download it. I guess it's a takeaway material to look into it more, perhaps.
Yeah, I don't know that. What we don't know is we the main way that we're letting people know about this app is when they visit the centre. People discover things, discover apps, but I think mostly it'll be people who visited the centre who go home and want to explore more. Maybe school students what I'd really hope is that if they're doing assignments, there's great material on the apps for them to, primary source material, survivor testimony. It's a great resource, and it's local survivors, it's Melbourne survivors, it's their stories. So I think that was probably the main audience for the app. people who visited the centre, so I don't know that it's so much a way in, but there will be people around the world. In fact, I don't know, I haven't really looked at the demographics of where the people are who are downloading it, but that would be interesting if there's people just, you know, in Holland or America somewhere just stumbling upon it and learning about our centre, because it is a way to learn about the centre as well.
Well, I've got 250 students plus in this unit, and so they'll be forced to choose to download it,
Okay,
hopefully in the coming weeks.
By, you know, 10% or so our
Yeah,
uptake.
yeah. No, it's a great little app. Yeah.
It's free, so we're not making any money out of it. And the whole point of the museum is to provide access to information about the Holocaust, not to in any way make money. So, you know, our goal is just to disseminate the history through, and mostly through personal experiences of that period, because I just find that's the best way for, you know, you can read history books, and I recommend people do, but to really find out about how the Holocaust affected individuals, you've got to go to the individual stories. Well, there's a couple of things. One is, so one of the major issues I think all museums face when they have testament people speaking is the sound bleed. So I know that as a curator, there's a little bit of a challenge with our education department, because when they take students through the museum, if the screens have too much volume, the way we take students around the museum is one guide takes about 6 or 8 students, and there's a conversation going on. So other sound in the background bleeding into those conversations is annoying for the museum guides. So they tend to try and turn things down, and then I usually come through the museum and there's no one in there, and I'm like, you can't hear anything. So I'm going around turning everything back up. So that was one issue. So we put the story pods in this other room, so that, and it's a wider room, there's just more room, people can go through the middle and people can be on the sides accessing the information in the story pods. It just was the logical place to put it, but you do always have to be mindful of where you put screens versus static displays. It has to all work in together.
Yeah. Right.
You know, the exhibition designers, that's their challenge, I guess. What you need, first of all, is more space for in a museum. We cram quite a bit into a short space, so that issue of the sound bleed really relates back to space. If people could walk into a little booth, a little separate, and watch material that's more soundproofed, little mini cinemas are great to have, a little alcoves that people can go in and engage with more visual media, audio. So it's great to have the space to be able to walk away. I'd also like people to, that entry point to a museum, some museums do it brilliantly, where it is a big screen experience. You get a screen experience and then you go into the museum. So I think that's great. You know, the better they get, the sound we have in the museums, they come from these cones that sit above the screens, and they're pretty good, but we need much more like Get Smart's cone of silence, where you really, something lowers over your head. And, you know, it's always this challenge, because the best thing is when people put headphones on, and you have a whole bank of them, and everyone can come up, put their own headphone on. That sound doesn't bleed at all. You get to hear a really good quality sound, but these are challenging things, having a whole bank of headphones that are always working. That's another issue.
And does it feel old-fashioned these days to have the headphones
there?
I mean, it's sort of a hard thing, yeah.
You know, I went to Mona, the art gallery in Tasmania, and it's all very cutting edge, and you get your own, it's almost like an iPad, it's called the iPod, it's like the O. And you get your own headphones, and everyone's walking around and you're looking at art, there's no labels, and all the information is on these screens and via the headphones. And I don't like it at all, because I found too many people are walking around with headphones on, staring at little screens, trying to read, trying to find things, and not really engaging with the art or having... If you go to a museum with someone and you both got headphones on, so you miss the opportunity to actually have dialogue with each other. Because although you can tap the person, they might be in the middle of listening to something, they don't want to be disturbed. So the good thing that Mona does is you can come home and it's tracked your visit and you can download everything that you've looked at. Now, I would love this as a future idea, that people could walk around. If there's something they're interested in, they press a button, and then when they get home, all the information and extra material on those subjects can suddenly appear before them. Other items we've got in the collection. Because when you're walking around a museum, there's a limit to how much you can read, how much you can take in. But sometimes when you go back, you're home, you've got more time to explore the things that you're really interested in. So I see it as a bit of the idea of it stimulating your interest. But there's, people cannot read books on walls. There's just a limit. So, 1 hour tour through the museum, and that's being generous because a lot of people, the students only get 20 minutes or so. But if you've got an hour and you walk around the museum, you can take in quite a bit. But you might, it might be better to be able to reflect at home. And the other thing I wanted to talk about was where the story pods, this is what I forgot to mention before, where did they come from? They actually came from a really old school idea. I mean, I prefer old style museums, not much technology. That's what I like. I like looking at objects and what's the story? Why is that cutlery on display? It's just a knife and fork, and then you read a whole story. So the objects, they're ordinary objects, but they take you into these extraordinary stories. Now, the story pod idea came from the fact that we had, let's say, 20 or 30 survivor guides. And depending which day you came, you'd encounter, Abby and David, but not Lucia. And, so whatever day you came was just random which survivors you would meet. And then you wouldn't meet all the others. So I started thinking, how can we have all their stories? Like, they've come every week for so many years. It would be great if their stories were the feature stories in the museum. So it started with just a basic arch lever folder for each survivor who guided, and it was a bank of them on the wall. Each one had their own folder, and it was a picture book. It had on each page one photo. It could be a photo from their family. It could be a photo of something they had on, an item, an artifact, a Jewish star. So each page, it told their stories in about 8 or 10 pages. An image is like a picture book, an image and a bit of text, image, a bit of text. It was, you could stand there and in 10 minutes, 5 minutes, you could take in one person's story, and you could dabble in a few of them. So out of these came the idea of, for each survivor, let's have a drawer, and you pull out a drawer, and there is their star, the real star, and there is a photo, and there's a bit of text, and that's their story. But it was like, it ended up being about 30 stories. So where were we going to find? We need a big space to have 30 drawers that you could pull out. And so then the technological sort of solution came about. Well, let's have this virtual drawer, or virtual desk for each survivor. So the visitor comes and they're like a historian, and they open the drawer, or they get to the desk. This is Lucia's desk. Wow, look, what's in this folder? And then you touch on the folder and there appears all her items. So you're discovering their story, and that was really how it all sort of evolved into being the desk. And that was also the chance meeting with Abhijit, who had come to the Holocaust Centre to do a photography project, photographing survivors. And this was many years ago, and before the museum had been upgraded, and he said, you really could do with some better technology. And I told him that we were planning on upgrading the museum, and he said, well, give me a chance, I've got some ideas, let me show you what I could do. And, it turned out that photography was just his hobby, and he was actually a computer engineer, programmer, guru, and he came up with the StoryPod concept. So that was, it was matching an idea, a need, with someone who had the technological skills, and then I guess the great thing about Abhijit was he also had a great design aesthetic, so he came up with a whole metaphor of making it look old and making it look like a desk. So that's really the history of the evolution of the story pods. So I'm very happy with the outcome, and it is sometimes quite random how these things evolve.